How long does it take to turn a good man into a demon? The answer is 6 days. Today we have a video look at the Stanford Prison Experiment, the most famous psychology experiment ever conducted by mankind, and how to apply the results of this experiment in your life. The Stanford Prison Experiment was able to create a stir in psychology and around the world simply because it exposed the most naked nature of human nature. If a person is placed in a certain situation and given more rights than others, there is a high likelihood that that person will abuse those rights and unleash the evil side of human nature. Going back to the late 1960s, when then U.S. President Richard Nixon expanded the Vietnam War into Laos and Cambodia. There was a great deal of television and newspaper coverage of the realities of the Vietnam War, including much of the violence perpetrated by U.S. troops against Vietnamese civilians. In particular, on March 16, 1968, the U.S. Army carried out a massive massacre of unarmed civilians in the village of My Lai in South Vietnam, resulting in the deaths of 347,504 civilians. Therein lies one of the most perplexing questions since the outbreak of war in mankind. Most of the people in the army were children of ordinary families. So why did these young men lose their humanity when they went to war and participated in such shocking atrocities? This question caught the idea of Philip Zimbardo, a professor in the psychology department at Stanford University. What is it about good people that makes them collectively bad? With the mindset of unraveling this question, Professor Philip Zimbardo used $15 per volunteer per day to recruit 24 college students who appeared to be in perfect physical and mental health from newspapers to complete a 14-day prison simulation experiment. The students joined for fun or to earn some pocket money, but little did they know that this seemingly fun experiment would become a lifelong nightmare. Zimbardo, in advance, in the Stanford University Psychology Department building basement 1-to-1 restoration of the prison space. Before the official start of the experiment, with a random drawing of the way to select 9 people to play the role of guards, 9 people to play the role of prisoners, the other 6 people to replace. And 3 rules were promulgated to these 24 students who participated in the experiment. First, in the prison, the prisoners had no names, only numbers. Second, the prisoners were only allowed to enjoy the lowest food, while the guards were allowed to do the opposite. Third, the guards were not allowed to use force against the prisoners, but were not restricted from using other punishments. Zimbardo even invited the local police department to cooperate with them in the experiment, allowing them to strictly follow the process of arresting a crime. To go to the home of the students playing the role of prisoners to arrest the students, and the students playing the role of guards are also wearing police uniforms with batons to increase the authority. After arriving at the experimental prison, similar to a real prison, the prisoners and volunteers were not allowed to move freely once they were locked in the prison. And the 3 of them lived in a small cubicle and could only be let out in the corridor. Everything is prepared and stabilized. The experiment can begin. On the first day, the prisoners were checked naked and sterilized by the guards, and the 2 parties were fairly peaceful. They hadn't really gotten into their roles yet. On the second day, the prisoners were very unserious and actually started to rebel because they were bored. They assemble in a cell, tear the numbered tags off their bodies, refuse to obey orders, and speak to provoke the guards, who, in turn, are completely at a loss. Professor Zimbardo, who plays the warden, begins to demand that they exercise their right to take measures to maintain order in the prison. The guards then use fire extinguishers to suppress the prisoners' entry into their rooms, strip all the prisoners naked, dismantle their beds, and put the worst of the pricks in solitary confinement, where the riot is eventually quelled. On the third day, the experiment began to spiral out of control, and to prevent the prisoners from rioting again, the guards began to take punitive measures, punishing the prisoners with sit-ups, stripping them naked, confinement, confiscation of pillows and bedding, forcing the prisoners to clean the toilets by hand, and depriving the prisoners of sleep. The guards were quick to learn, and the punishments became more and more outrageous. They also resorted to psychological polarization tactics, where prisoners who obeyed the administration were given privileges and assigned better cells and better food. Inmates who behaved badly were put in solitary confinement. No one cleaned up their urine and feces, and the environment became worse and worse. Slowly, many learned to obey, but of course some prisoners can't take the abuse and have mental breakdowns. Prisoner number 8612 received extra care from the guards because he had led the others to rebel against the guards' management earlier in the day. In the end, he had a nervous breakdown because he couldn't stand the immense mental pressure. He began to cry and curse hysterically and demanded to be withdrawn. Professor Zimbardo had to release him early and fill his place with replacement subjects. On the fourth day, the continued beatings destroyed the will of the prisoners, who accepted their status, became more dependent on the guards, followed their orders, and longed for the privilege of being clothed and fed from their hands. However, another prisoner, 819, also suffered an emotional breakdown and was unable to eat, and Professor Zimbardo had no choice but to let him go. At this point, the other inmates actually began to talk about how 819 was a loser, how useless he was, and how he was dragging us down. Hearing these comments, 819 broke down and cried. When Zimbardo removed his ankle cuffs and signaled him to leave the prison and go to the hospital, he refused in tears and wanted to go back to prove to others that he was not a loser. At this time, the professor told him that you are not an 819, you are not a prisoner, you have your own name. After hearing these words, the volunteer slowly came back to his senses and left the simulated prison. On the fifth day, both sides of the experiment fell deeply into their roles. The guards became more and more powerful, they forgot that this was just an experiment, and from the bottom of their hearts they thought that the prisoners and the guards were two very different creatures. They abused and humiliated them even more fiercely, and with the failure of their continuous resistance, the inmates began to become much more docile. But the more submissive the prisoners became to the guards, the more the guards intensified their forms of punishment. Seemingly caught in some kind of vicious circle, all of them immersed in the virtual world designed by Zimbardo could hardly extricate themselves. On the sixth day of the experiment, a female visitor arrives at the site, who is Professor Zimbardo's girlfriend. The girlfriend was shocked by the brutality of the guards and the situation of the prisoners at the site. She argued with Zimbardo with anger and fear, and finally scolded him to wake up. Zimbardo gathered the guards and the prisoners, and announced that the prison experiment, which was originally planned to last 14 days, ended prematurely on the sixth day. How does that explain the results of the Stanford Prison Experiment? Is it that human nature is evil? We can get the answer from Zimbardo's communication with both participants after the experiment. After the experiment, Zimbardo chatted with participants from both sides of the experiment. Firstly, from the guards, one of the guards said, "I used to be a friendly person and I was surprised that I did such a thing to myself. I humiliated them because I thought I had to watch out for the prisoners in case they did something." Another guard stated that during the inspection I went to cell 2 and messed up an inmate's bed that he had just made. He screamed and questioned me why I did it. It made me feel like it was fun to have power or authority. It was a great pleasure. On the other hand, there was feedback from the inmates, who were also confused and exasperated with their performance in the simulated prison. One of the inmates stated, "I am a strong and confident person and I can't imagine myself responding to this kind of abuse by being submissive, yielding, and based on the results of the experiment and communication with the experimenters, Zimbardo came to an important conclusion that external circumstances can spawn evil. If a person is placed in a specific environment and given rights beyond what other people have, then that person will abuse the power in their hands. Conversely, if a person is deprived of all rights, so that his words and actions cannot affect any external world, then he will be submissive and compliant, and his behavior will be influenced more by his external environment than by his character. In the experiment, the prison guards felt an increase in their self-worth by exercising their power to fulfill their desires. This process of self-realization of power and desire made them more willing to use brutal means to maintain their position of authority. The prisoners were in a passive state in the experiment, losing their freedom and dignity, and they had to rely on the instructions of the guards and display a submissive attitude in order to survive in this environment. According to Zimbardo, no matter what kind of person it is, if you give him a little power and put a uniform on him, this person will immediately become another person. And if you then weave a noble-sounding reason for him, such as for the sake of all mankind or a certain grandiose goal, this person is likely to do very cruel things and even commit acts against human nature. This theory can be verified from too many world-class events. However, the revelation of prison experiments around us also often, which can explain why we know a lot of people, friends or co-workers, know the initial period is one way and the other side to obtain certain rights. It will be completely changed into another way, and our feedback for him will be as the other side of the change, unconscious change. The feedback we give to them will also change unconsciously as the other person changes. Do you already have the shadow of some people in your mind, including yourself? For many ordinary families, Being in power equals supremacy in a relationship. Economic power and a status like parenthood is enough to change a parent who is obsequious in life and oppressed, and then it's their turn to take out those injustices and emotions that they suffer in the home environment where they hold power on the children who are in control, emotionally abducting them, verbally abducting them, and even engaging in brutal beatings to achieve obedient parenting of their children. What about the reverse? When did many children first gain the right to a family? I have carefully observed that it is not after the child has grown up, but after the child has taken power, and the child has certain rights in society or has gained certain achievements. This is the time when the structure of the family is rearranged because of the change in power. Similarly, a child's thoughts and behaviors that were once irrational and incorrect in the eyes of the parents can instantly be understood and approved when the child is empowered. Even when a child reaches a certain height of social power, his position and power in the family can become supreme. This is what I think is the most important conclusion of this experiment when placed in a life scenario. When we have irreconcilable conflicts and quarrels with our family of origin, we might as well spend a little time improving ourselves. When you achieve certain accomplishments, it equates to a corresponding certain power in your family. And because of the hidden benefits that come with that power, humans are born with the desire to pursue power because it's just too easy for us to gain the ability to control others. Sometimes there is no line between whether we are good or bad, between good and evil. It just depends on what kind of environment you are in or whether you hold power. It is recommended that we often shift our perspective to see if we have been confined by those current circumstances into a situation where we are being bullied by power, and to remind ourselves that when we are in the center of power, we don't become bullies by doing whatever we want. This is also a way of checking and becoming aware of the self, and to end with a quote from the famous French actress Jean Moreau, reminding ourselves to try not to be trapped in certain identities or self-experiences. We are prisoner of our own experience. Perhaps human nature is evil, and we are all prisoners of our own experience, unless we gain self-respect.